Welcome to the 6th IGC Events webinar focus on geothermal, which is presented by ThinkGeoEnergy and Enerchange. My name is Jochen Schneider. I am the Director of Enerchange and glad to welcome you and Alexander Richter, the Director of the Iceland Renewable Energy Cluster and the Principal of ThinkGeoEnergy. Shortly about focus on geothermal. This webinar is recorded and you can follow up next week on the Enerchange YouTube channel. Please follow us also on LinkedIn and Twitter with likes and comments. You are all invited to comment and ask questions related to the slides in the chat, also during the presentation. I will pick up the questions from you and will present later to Alex in the discussion. Let's get started with today's webinar, Where Are Things Going with Geothermal? For this presentation, we welcome Alexander Richter. Alexander is a German lawyer who lives since many years in Iceland. He was at the Glitnir Iceland Banki till 2011. Then he founded ThinkGeoEnergy, built up this great news platform and became the huge data mine of geothermal energy worldwide. We are cooperating now since 2016 when we organized the first IGC Turkey in Izmir and invented together Geothermal Haberle, the Turkish news platform. In the last 2 years, he was the president of the IGA. At the end of his presidency, he changed to the position of the head of the Iceland Renewable Energy Cluster and Iceland Geothermal. With all of this background knowledge, he will have today a critical look at the development of geothermal. We are looking forward to an interesting presentation and an engaged discussion with hopefully lots of contributions from you. The webinar will terminate at 3 p.m. So, Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jochen, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of the thoughts on where the geothermal industry is going. As Jochen has said, I just recently started as the managing director of the Iceland Geothermal and the Iceland Renewable Energy Cluster, and in that sense represent the renewable energy industry and the geothermal industry of Iceland internationally. And in that context, naturally also is part of my commentary as of this presentation and this webinar. As we all know, COVID-19 and the current situation is the big elephant in the room. And with the uncertainties involved, a lot of the things that we're discussing here today are still unsure, but maybe also will evolve in a more positive or more negative way, who knows. So briefly, I think we've all experienced that the industry has gone increasingly digital or hybrid in the last couple of weeks and months, in the sense of companies, events, providing webinars, online events, and essentially trying to stay engaged in the industry. But I think I can speak for many of us is that this is a challenge because this interhuman interaction has been and continues to be an elementary part of doing business. So even if these events are a fantastic way to follow and engage, they're just not providing the same quality of interaction. So some of these events actually doing a hybrid approach and allowing interaction in chat rooms and the likes. And this is an approach to keep things alive. And I think this is very recommendable, and I encourage you to participate in these events, specifically for certain regions. And naturally, we then also hope to meet at the postponed World Geothermal Congress next year here in Iceland. I gave a presentation earlier this year on the geothermal market and the current status. And there I gave an update on estimates for geothermal power generation capacity development in the next 5 years. And naturally, things are looking a little bit different. There's a delay in shipments of equipment to the sites. With construction, certain projects had to delay the start of drilling. So I would assume that a lot of the development that were scheduled for 2020 and 2021 will actually pushed by at least a year. And that will actually affect also the capacity coming online this and next year. But with all the preparation going on, I think we might even see that some of the projects are probably in a better position to speed up then development. So we might actually see some of the development speed coming up and even becoming faster. At the end of 2019, we had 15,400 megawatt installed capacity. The numbers between different organizations differ a little bit. That's based on the approach to measuring or accounting for capacity data. But the capacity is around 15 to 16,000 megawatts. But naturally, as we said, the main topic of this presentation is to, or this webinar today is really looking where is geothermal going. And naturally, this is not only $1 million question, it's the millions of dollars of question. And naturally, if you look at where geothermal is going, there are several elements that affect how the geothermal industry is moving forward. There's a geographical element, there's an element of technology, there's the utilization for what are we using geothermal for, power or heat and cooling. The increasing interest of the oil and gas sector will definitely change certain elements of the sector, if not the sector as a whole. And then how geothermal will be part of the overall energy transition, both globally but also regionally. And going into the geographic elements. If you look at where or how geothermal is affected in the geographical context, we couldn't actually go through all the different countries and regions and give you specific elements. But there are a number of key themes that we see affecting local or regional geothermal development. Number one is the energy demand. With the current economic situation and the restrictions in travel, et cetera, we've seen a drop in energy demand in a lot of the geothermal countries going forward. So we see the situation in Iceland, in New Zealand, the decision there of an aluminum smelter being shut down frees up a lot of power generation capacity in that country and essentially affecting already concretely a planned geothermal development. And this might actually be the case in different countries as well. We even see a drop in electricity demand in Kenya. And naturally, then that would also then affect additional planning for projects either ongoing or planned. We're seeing also market conditions in specific countries differing. In Indonesia, for example, naturally the countries are affected by the economic situation and with funding being limited. So sources of funding drying out, and the challenge of not being able to support incentive schemes that have been driving geothermal development. At the same time, we see a reawakening of interest in geothermal due to energy security, etc. For example, in the Philippines, we see an increasing emphasis on cleaning up the heating sector in Europe and in China. So all of that are different elements that affect geothermal development regionally in those countries and regions. And I think this is an important aspect to consider. In North America, and I will touch upon this in the context of the oil and gas sector, naturally the market has been challenging for the renewable energy sector due to political circumstances. But with the current situation in the oil and gas sector, there is an increasing interest and political will to maybe do a technology transfer or even a transfer of the workforce and prepping it for a future where oil and gas will not be as big as it has been in the past decades. Political support is a crucial element, and we see that there continues to be political support for geothermal development, but the economic realities in certain countries often require funding to go to more immediate needs than long-term clean energy, and that's naturally a shame, but that's the reality today. On ongoing development, we see travel restriction accessibilities of countries and air travel having an impact on certain projects. So for example, drilling in Ethiopia, which just started just with the beginning of the COVID situation, was put on hold for a couple of weeks and months, but had just recently restarted. And we see similar development elsewhere where equipment was not able to be shipped, where stuff that was to be set up in plants was not able to travel on site. So all of those restrictions have an impact on ongoing development, but also on planning development and creating certain uncertainties. But we hope that with the evolvement of the different economies and travel restrictions being lifted increasingly, that we might see that a positive impact on geothermal development. In Iceland, there is, as I said, we also face a situation of a dropping energy demand. And the question has always been how do we diversify in Iceland the sale of the electricity. So making ourselves independent or less dependent on particular large customers of electricity. There have been efforts over many years on innovation and entrepreneurship. Here, the idea is to attract different industry to Iceland to utilize the energy sources at hand, and that naturally includes geothermal. So research projects like CarbFix or carbon recycling and others are projects that are showcasing ways of how we can utilize geothermal beyond heat and electricity. Another project is extracting silica as a market for skincare products, etc., etc. So there's a large emphasis taken on pushing innovation in geothermal and for the renewable energy at all. And at the same time, and that's we face the same situation as our colleagues in New Zealand, is that the sector naturally here in the country, when there's less local development, is looking at ways to promote the services provided by the Icelandic players internationally, and that naturally applies to many other countries as well. So there is this international competition for providing services to the sector. Going into the technology, and actually technology is also, not also, it is a big element of our industry, and it naturally impacts on where we as an industry are going. And in the context of power generation, the choice of technology for changing steam or heat into electricity is a large part and a big element. And I think this picture here that shares how much capacity has been added in the last 5 years by the different technologies shows the incredible growth of binary cycle technology for power generation. And I would say that with ongoing development, we will continue to see that trend, and we will see binary cycle technology represent a large, if not the largest part of turbines being set up for geothermal power generation. But there are naturally several other technology elements that will be the theme for geothermal going forward. In the context of distributed energy, the question is, are we moving away from large-scale development to smaller-scale development? Are we seeing more distributed power generation that could be still somewhat centralized in a way of having power generation at each well instead of one plant and then steam gathering systems? But one trend is very obvious, and that was shown with the large binary technology development, is that we've seen the average size of units being set up decreasing. So in the case of Indonesia and Turkey, the average size in Indonesia is around 50 megawatts per per power plant. In Turkey, it's about 18 megawatts. So to show really is that the size of plants has dropped, and we see even with incoming technology players providing, we would say, small scale, even super small scale units. In this case, for example, ORC units of 150 kilowatt size, changing naturally the picture completely. But how overall, in the overall context of geothermal, how much they will contribute in megawatt numbers to the overall development will have to be seen if they will be a remarkable share of the market. But it will play an important part in specific countries and will expand the opportunities for geothermal. So that is very obvious. So we will see more geothermal development. So today we have about 27 countries producing electricity from geothermal, and we see that this number can increase up to 80 countries in the coming years. And naturally, small scale and binary technology will expand the markets for geothermal quite extensively, given that we are able to tap into lower temperature resources as well. The other question is, how do we derive the heat from the ground? Naturally, so far the focus on the geothermal sector has been to drill into existing reservoirs, tapping into fluids, both dry steam and wet steam, but also hot water, and then deriving that heat with that water to the surface. Now there have been over many years this talk about creating closed loop systems. There's now concrete projects that are addressing this technology to be set up to derive heat from the ground, both for heating of buildings, but also for power generation. And the interesting part is that this is a technology that particularly the oil and gas sector sees as incredibly interesting, given that it seemingly provides the scale that they would see needed to enter the geothermal sector. And I will touch upon this a little bit later on. Drilling technology, naturally, a lot of that has naturally come from the oil and gas sector, but drilling naturally in hot temperature resources makes this differ a little bit. But we see the continued interest in increasing drilling speed, making drilling cheaper, both with hammer drilling, with laser-based or plasma-based drilling, etc. So this is definitely something that will have an impact and hopefully translate into lower development costs. Then the engineered or enhanced geothermal systems, EGS, naturally being applied already in conventional geothermal projects to stimulate reservoirs for better productivity. But pure EGS projects have been relatively limited, and I think the biggest project ongoing is the one funded by the US Department of Energy in Utah, the Utah Forge project. And what has been very positive is that despite funding challenges of the geothermal sector, this project continues to be funded by the US government and continues this important work, which hopefully will also support EGS development and internationally and provide expertise and technology. So this is something that will naturally also impact how we're going forward. And with this project continuing, this is a very positive aspect. Oil and gas sector, here naturally the question is always how can and will the oil and gas sector enter the geothermal sector? It is very obvious that given the low oil prices, the oil sector is facing tremendous challenges. And I think this translates also in a very qualified, subsurface oriented and experienced workforce looking for jobs. And there's an opportunity for the geothermal sector here to tap into good know-how and experience. The challenge with that is naturally is there sufficient development going on? Is there sufficient funding to hire these people, to hire the companies that would provide those services? And with that, I think we would also need a very strong discussion on the oil and gas sector, not only providing the technology and the workforce, but also the funding going forward. So by joining the geothermal industry, the oil and gas companies could tap in and build upon their subsurface oriented know-how and experience, and apply their experience in an industry that is built on a similar approach of extracting a natural resource. And that is something that we need to emphasize and strengthen the role of the oil and gas sector in geothermal and the role they can play. And if they're clearly looking at wind and solar, geothermal should be another obvious choice, and this is something that we need to emphasize. And having said that, with that technology and experience, this could be very positive for geothermal if we are able to get the sufficient government support, but also the investment of the oil and gas sector. There's another aspect, naturally, and this is the heating side of our industry, direct use of heat. And what I personally find extremely interesting is seeing the blurring lines of what we call the shallow geothermal versus the deep geothermal, and the way we derive and utilize the heat. And here, an interesting discussion or a project in Helsinki in Finland, in Europe, where the local heating utility is tapping into shallow geothermal, deep heat exchange systems, and ultra deep heat exchange systems for district heating. And it will be extremely interesting to see how this can work together. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot more happening in geothermal, in the sense of how we create these hybrid opportunities, not only utilizing heat and for heating and power generation and cooling, but also how we tap different technologies to together provide a product called heat. And this, I think, will be extremely interesting. And we need to engage with that heat exchange industry to see how we can marry our technologies better for a better future for all of us. And actually, the discussions continue on direct use. And like I said, heating is the obvious discussion. And we see an incredible list of names of countries that are exploring geothermal that we never had on our agenda or on our map as potential geothermal countries. So the Netherlands, Scandinavia, etc. So we're seeing all this development now, which is extremely interesting. And we will have to see how this will evolve. But with that ongoing and this political support, it is incredible to see that this will expand our industry tremendously beyond the power generation market, which it will be comparably small. I mentioned before the oil and gas sector, and there recently was a very interesting online event organized out of Austin, Texas, and actually tapping into the know-how and the discussions and people in the oil and gas sector, both in Texas, but also internationally. And the idea is how, or the event was about pivoting from the hydrocarbon sector to the heat sector, so to utilizing the geothermal heat for power generation. And I guess the discussion was less so on heating, but the idea really was how can we get the oil and gas sector to enter the geothermal sector. And the discussions were varied and went all about how to enter the geothermal sector, the technologies involved, and I mentioned part of that earlier, the service sector. But what was, I think, particularly interesting for me is that the experience of the oil and gas sector to be able to tap into the political arena to gather support is something that we should use and have support the oil and gas sector entering geothermal. At the same time, certain business models, etc., would be something that we can learn from the oil and gas sector. And last but not least, naturally, the investment of the oil and gas sector needed. And last but not least, what will impact the geothermal sector tremendously are the different stimulus programs being put in place right now, with probably the most prominent being the European Green Deal. Here, this picture does not show geothermal, which is a shame, but geothermal is and will be an elementary part of the European Green Deal, simply to the fact is that heating and cooling is a tremendous large part of the energy market in Europe, in particular for carbon emissions. And that's why geothermal is a very attractive source of energy. And that's why we as an industry need to emphasize a lot there to gather the support and push geothermal in the sense of what geothermal can provide in that context. But this is positive, but we cannot sit still and wait for this to happen. We need to be actively seeking those opportunities and push the geothermal narrative in all of those discussions. And that is in Europe, but also beyond, in North America, Asia, and so on. With that, I want to close, and hopefully there will be some questions and a discussion here. But let me end with saying is that where geothermal is going depends on us. Where do we want it to go? Where are we being driven by other forces? But the opportunities are there. The opportunities are great, but we have to be on our toes to promote and sell geothermal everywhere we can, and particularly in the political arena, and in the cases where we're seeing a dropping demand and support, we need to be innovative, figuring out ways of positioning geothermal, creating business opportunities for us, but also for the customers that we're going to serve. And with that, I just want to promote our IGC Invest Geothermal event, which was scheduled in March of this year. We had to postpone this. We will now be holding the event on September 17th in Frankfurt. But given naturally the circumstances and the uncertainties, the event will be a hybrid event. So you will be able to participate online, but naturally also on site in Frankfurt if you can, and are open to that. Further information you can find on igc.events, and we're looking forward to see you in this event or also participating in the event online. With that, I hand over to Jochen.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for this nice presentation. And we already have some questions. The first one is, I'd like to hear your thoughts on geobattery or geologic thermal energy storage.
Very good question, and that's actually something I just realized I forgot the discussion, for example, on utilizing mine water for heating, which is essentially a form of energy. And in that context, energy storage, for example, in aquifers that are being used in the winter to derive warm water for heating, or in the summer to cool buildings, is a fantastic opportunity. It taps into our know-how of the subsurface and how we can use this. So it will be very interesting to see how this will play a part. But I consider this to be an incredible opportunity for us as a geothermal sector. And I understand that a lot of the service or the companies that are working in the sector have been involved in some of these projects. So this is a great opportunity and will naturally expand the opportunities and the options of what we have to sell as an industry.
Thank you for this answer. And perhaps there is to mention, in general, geothermal has many opportunities. You just spoke about the thermal storage and also the issues you're developing in Iceland with calcifics and so on. But there is also this mineral extraction. We can deliver heat, we can deliver cooling and electricity, we can deliver water for thermal spas. So there is really a very huge field of application we can offer. Another question. I'm wondering, is the seismic risk something that is a possible hindrance to the geothermal development?
The seismicity naturally has always been a topic in the discussions on geothermal and what it implies. And naturally, in regions that have ongoing earthquakes and seismic events, certain seismic events related to geothermal are maybe not as impactful. But the more we develop geothermal in urban areas, for example, in Europe, the more seismicity plays a role, particularly in areas where there is no experience with seismicity, and let's say maybe even the buildings are not set up to support seismic events. At the same time, I think there's a lot of misconception on geothermal and the risk to seismic events. It is to us as an industry to provide sufficient information, honest information about seismicity and potential seismicity from projects. And if there are seismic events, that we are open to inform the public and support this and have safety measures built in. And I think this has been addressed by several countries, for example, in the Netherlands, where certain risk elements are set up in security measurements and requirements for geothermal development. And I think with that in place, seismicity will not be as much of an issue, but it's something that we as an industry need to address. If there is a risk, we have to talk about it. If there's no risk, we have to be aware that there's a fear and we need to engage with the public. But I think I would say that we've learned a lot in the last few years, and it's all about the communication with the authorities and the general public in the surrounding of these projects.
Thank you. I would just want to mention it's also dependent on the region where you are. When we remember the presentation of Daniel Mölk, he's in the middle of nowhere, and so seismicity is not the big issue like it's in Middle Europe, where it's very crowded here. Then there is a comment, very nice presentation, and another question. Which markets do you see a strong future for geothermal? New Zealand is one, but curious about Europe, as different countries are in different stages of the energy transition. Thank you for this very informative webinar.
Well, thank you too for your comment. But I think generally the notion really is that we need to differentiate the opportunities for the electricity and the direct use market. And in the electricity market, naturally, we will see continued development worldwide, and more so in specific countries that have good resources and a sufficient political or governmental support scheme. But at the same time, we will likely see, let's say, less electricity development in Europe, or particularly in Central Europe, but more heat development. So the geothermal market will grow differently in different markets based on different specifics. So while I see challenges on, let's say, for example, in Mexico with current political arena and in Central America due to funding difficulties, Africa or Kenya and Ethiopia will see this continued development driven by funding from donor countries. But in Europe, I definitely see this increasing interest by all kinds of players, including some of the oil and gas players, into heating development. And that creates opportunities that probably that market didn't even exist, quite 10, 20 years ago. So for us as an industry, that kind of continues to create, and let it help our industry to grow. So the opportunities are great in Europe, particularly in that regard. But like I said, we need to be on our toes. And the other thing really is that as an industry, we need to look at what our customers. So we have electricity customers, but we have heat customers, but we also have customers that are looking, for example, for minerals in geothermal brine. Naturally, lithium is the topic that everybody talks about, but that has created a momentum for us as an industry and an interest, for example, in California, where we will see geothermal coming in through the back door and see increased development, for example, in California. And with that, this creates different dynamics. And while it might not directly be then geothermal help us as a geothermal project, it indirectly does, because with that comes geothermal power generation. So this makes it very interesting and kind of increases the value proposition that we have to offer.
Just one thing to mention to your comment regarding Europe, where you see the heat in front, but the heat is just a business for the winter times, and we have to think also how can it become more economic, and there is also the electricity needed, especially here in the south of Germany. We are still discussing about the long transmission lines, but we have in the end the heat in place just below our feet, and we just have to exploit it.
That's true, and I think this is something that where I would say we as an industry not only need to look at the technical elements of our industry, like drilling risk and drilling and how we transfer the energy, but we also need to look at the business model. So if, for example, the business model of a heat plant is challenged due to the fact that we only need heat, let's say 4, 5, 6 months of the year, then the question is, what do we do with the other 5 to 6 years? And then the question, what model would work to make this work? And I think this is something that where we need this innovation, also in that regard, how we can make this work. And this provides some interesting approaches. And I think how to deal with these demand cycles will be another element that will be very, very interesting. And naturally, the question could be if geothermal could then be an opportunity for cooling then in that time. And I think a similar approach is taken in Munich. But all kinds of options naturally will have to be looked at, and creates both challenges but also opportunities for someone that's innovative, figuring out a way of how to utilize and make value out of it.
The next question is, hi Alexander, thank you for a very informative presentation, much enjoyed it. Coming back to your statements towards the end, why does geothermal energy appear to find less political, financial and lobbying as compared to wind?
Yeah, so this question, I've received this question a lot, and I think in simple terms is that the political arena has, and it's a longer term in the longer term already, but it has really changed to a very short-term driven political arena. So, for example, and that's a challenge with geothermal, is that a geothermal project takes 4 to 7 years, depending on what projects you're building. So for a politician to support a geothermal project maybe might not give him the photo opportunity he needs for the next elections. And that's been one of the big challenges in the political arena. At the same time, is that naturally with geothermal, we always talk about the risk, the drilling risk, the success rates, the high upfront cost, and that has been a challenging thing to sell to politicians. At the same time is that we've not received the same incentives as other industries, and that's also then a challenge on how to do it. And the other element is a cost. So why we kind of still continue to be relatively competitive on a levelized cost of electricity production is that the low cost of wind and solar have been always put besides the geothermal part. And at this point in time still is that the baseload element is not valued correctly politically in a sense of the value it provides to a country and to the economy. I think that's a big challenge in that context with regards to wind and solar.
Perhaps the way of thinking is not right. We want to change energy system, but that everything is still based on the fossil energies. And perhaps if we want to change, we should think the other way around. We have to base it on a renewable version.
Yeah, so it is very interesting. I mean, and there's naturally this increasing talk about batteries, storage, energy storage, and the notion of how all these windmills, all these solar installations, how this energy can be stored in times when it produces to be used in times when it's not being used. So in all of these energy systems, you still need a base load power as part of a system. And then you can utilize wind and solar, the intermittent resources, differently, particularly then combined with storage. So that is very, very interesting. And I think there are some really interesting discussions in the US in the sense of the energy systems, how geothermal fits in there. And this is very interesting to see. But how this can play together will be. I don't really have an answer, but I think the notion will be is that understanding the value that baseload and geothermal can provide to a country, and then compare this to fossil fuels and not wind and solar, and then putting a cost on the actual impact that this energy technology has. For example, emissions.
Okay, thanks. We should proceed with more questions. Here is another one. Do you manage to explore the real geothermal potential in North Africa, in the Maghreb region?
There is not that, unfortunately, there's not that much information available on this particular region. I understand that in Morocco and elsewhere there have been some efforts made, and geothermal is used, for example, for greenhouses, and actually for power generation it could be an opportunity. How this could be utilized and developed, I unfortunately don't have enough information about that, but it definitely would be an interesting approach or a region to look into.
Thanks for this answer. There is another question. Is the data showed regarding power generation growth in the coming years global or regional, i.e. for Europe?
So the numbers that I presented as part of the presentation was giving a global overview based on project development that is ongoing and in construction, and that's globally. And of that, a lot of that was based in Africa, in Indonesia, but also in Central America and in South America, for example. And in Europe, but like I said, most of the development, I guess, was Indonesia and Africa.
Thanks for this answer. One of your slides mentions geothermal energy direct utilization for hydrogen, shell hydrogen to be precise. What's the application?
So this is in the context of Iceland. Is geothermal power generation actually utilized for hydrogen production? So it would be here with electricity. And again, this is the notion of understanding of demand versus availability, and understanding when energy is not available, you can utilize it for something else. In that case, for example, for hydrogen. This hydrogen station, this is actually an old picture that I showed, but it is in operation, and there are now efforts made in Iceland to produce hydrogen in this context at the moment with a hydropower plant, but naturally this could also then imply to a geothermal power plant here in the country and elsewhere. How much heat would play into hydrogen production, I would have to look into this. I don't know enough about that, unfortunately.
Thanks. The next question is there any European geothermal vision to convert North Sea decommissioning into mid-enthalpy geothermal sources?
To understand, so you're talking about oil platforms, for example. Do I understand this right? Or
yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So what is interesting to see is that we have different, and we had this discussion recently, is that there are different oil companies have different approaches on how to look into geothermal. We have companies like Equinor from Norway that have been looking at geothermal from a technology perspective. For example, with different technology elements where they can apply the technologies. So they have been, for example, part of the Iceland deep drilling project. And the technology approach and others have taken an approach of actually project development. And probably going forward, we will see differences. But my understanding is that oil companies have looked into offshore geothermal. I mean, off the coast of Ireland, for example, here in Iceland is an entity that looks into offshore geothermal. But again, I think it is in the context of the North Sea, for example, talked in the context of carbon capture and storage. So utilizing old oil fields for carbon storage. And naturally, the question would be if there's sufficient heat in those areas, how to utilize this. But then you always have the challenge of transportation or grid connection with these platforms. So I would say this is, to that day, is somewhat future music, but depending on how close or how much offshore these platforms are, this could potentially be an opportunity in connection with decommissioning of platforms. But the same can be said to existing onshore oil wells that produce hot water.
The next question is, you mentioned 1,700 megawatt increment for binary during 2015 to 2020. Do you expect the same trend for near future, and what sort of technology development do you expect to boost its popularity? Thank you for your interesting presentation.
Like I indicated, binary technology has expanded the geothermal market beyond, let's say, the high temperature areas of this world, so along the tectonic plates and the Pacific Ring of Fire. I mean, Germany is a good example here, where you have lower temperatures and binary allows you to produce electricity. So with that, I would say is that has been a large part of expanding the market. Turkey is probably the dominant market in that regard in the past few years, and probably accounts for 3/4 of that development. So yeah, I see this trend continuing. And I mean, the cost for binary technology has dropped a lot in the last 10 to 20 years, and it's way much closer to flash-based technologies. Technology being used for power generation, so the competitiveness is there. It gives you an opportunity to efficiently utilize the resource. With re-injection as part of these closed loop systems, it also makes it more attractive in urban areas. So yes, I see this trend continuing with binary technology, and would consider that the dominant part of power generation technology will be a binary technology.
Thanks. The next question: do you have an opportunity to share your thoughts on goals in geothermal development in terms of cap costs for $ per megawatt and $ per kilowatt hour delivered electricity?
This is indeed a very interesting question, and I think one of the challenges with regards to geothermal in the comparison of wind and solar is that we've seen the cost of wind and solar dropping dramatically year by year. To the point where now wind and solar are like incredibly low cost electricity. But we often see in all those discussions on the levelized cost of electricity generation, not an approach to value the capacity factors into this equation. And that provides a relatively unfair comparison between the levelized cost of electricity generation between wind and solar, because wind and solar does not provide it 24 hours a day like geothermal does. So purely comparing this on cost is challenging. Having said that, I think it is absolutely important that we need to drive down the cost for geothermal. Last but not least, through the different elements that are the big cost elements for geothermal. And today, I think the drilling part is, I think, 25 to 30%. So, and that's actually a huge element that we need to figure out to decrease. So speeding up drilling, faster drilling, better efficiency in drilling, but also recognizing or finding resources decreasing the risk, so making drilling more successful, even though in the overall context it is not as risky as we might perceive it. And on the turbine side of things, we see increasingly elements where power technology providers provide a more complete package of the power plant. So instead of selling only turbine and having a complicated EPC system, we have certain companies providing this all together, and thereby being able to decrease the cost of the construction. And I think we will see more and more these kinds of business development approaches to cut down the cost and the risk in development. And with that, hopefully we can overall drive down cost per megawatt installed capacity in the development. How much that will be, it's hard to say.
Another question is, how do you see the Middle East as a potential market for geothermal energy, desalination and cooling as keywords?
This is very interesting, and I participated, I think there was the last conference I attended was in Saudi Arabia, on particular that part, what role geothermal energy could play in Saudi Arabia, or in general, I guess, also in the Middle East. And the question here really is that power generation, is that a topic, or is it utilizing the heat, for example, for desalination? And here the context is of a country that is so inclined on or so built upon oil and gas. The opportunity here is really tapping that know-how, that funding, and also address a particular energy need. And here, in the case of desalination, which is a huge and energy intensive approach and very expensive approach, geothermal would be or is already partly a fantastic opportunity. And I think clearly something that with the right technology and the right player could play an important role. But it also, again, would require us as an industry to have a focus on the solution we actually provide to a specific problem, in this case desalination, and figuring out a way to sell this into these countries. The opportunities are there and they are marked.
Thanks, and there is a simple thank you for this presentation. One of the next comments. Then there is the question, what strategy is geothermal industry in Europe addressing to compete with lobby of the wind and PV industry?
So essentially, for everyone in the industry, the Geothermal Association, the national association or the international organizations play an important role in representing the interest of an industry. And in Europe, it is the European Geothermal Energy Council, EGEC, which is a partner to our event. The IGC event is playing an incredibly important role in the lobbying of geothermal towards the authorities in Brussels, towards the European organizations, and as part of the European Green Deal. And it is up to us as an industry to support these organizations in their work to get geothermal on the map and supported within the political system. And EGEC, like I said, plays that role for Europe and towards the European Union, and is something that we as an industry need to support to push this engagement. So I strongly encourage everyone to engage with, in the case of Europe, with EGEC, globally with the International Geothermal Association and others, and locally or nationally, to really support the representation. In the US, it's the GRC, and elsewhere. It is incredibly important that we support these organizations. They're doing an important job, often don't have the sufficient funding to do the work that they need to do. And it's up to us as an industry to support. And again, this is something where the oil and gas sector can come in very strongly, because the impact a growing geothermal sector could have to the oil sector and the workforce would be tremendous. So it's both a political interest, but also business interest of the sector.
Thanks. The next question, how do you see France investing into lithium capture out of geothermal wells as compared to Germany and UK?
Here I have to admit that I probably don't know sufficiently kind of what the status is on the lithium element in the context of France. Naturally, we know that the situation with regards to the resource is probably very similar to then on the French side of the Upper Rhine and of the Upper Rhine Valley. So the opportunities are probably the same, and we understand that lithium is a very important national energy security element, and given that France actually has also a car industry that looks into electric vehicles, lithium is a demand. So I would see that or consider that there's sufficient support in France as well for this project. But the attention clearly is on both the Salton Sea and California. It is on the Upper Rhine, and naturally recently with funding from the UK government for this project in Cornwall. So this is at least publicly gets the most attention, and we would ask our French colleagues what the status is, but clearly the attention is on the regions that I mentioned.
Well, I don't know if there is a funding directly from France for a project in the Alsace, but there is a project funded by the EU, the EuGLE project, which is, I think, done by the ES in a greater network with the Richter project. And in Germany, there is one scientific project funded by the state, actually. The next question is, why geothermal does not receive subsidies as other renewable energies?
Yeah, again, I mean, one cannot say it enough. I think the lobbying of our industry has not been as successful. A part of that has to do with the scale and the size of our industry. But at the same time, we as an industry have not taken sufficient money in our hands to do the representation of our industry right, particularly in the political arena. So again, I think we've the context is also is that geothermal has been more complex to sell as a topic to politicians, and that's been a big challenge, because we need to drill, and we have the risk of finding the heat and the water, and then we drill, then we need to kind of build the plant, so the time of the development. So all of these are elements that have made it difficult for us, but we haven't made our lives much easier as well, given that we've basically not pushy enough in the way of how geothermal can play a role as part of the energy transition. And I think this is something where we need to do a better homework. We need to work harder, and we've simply not gotten the attention. So we need to keep on fighting, and probably even more so, and now with the opportunities that we can provide.
Yes, but it depends also on the decision makers. If you look, for example, to the Netherlands, they have a great plan what they want to pick up from the ground. The national oil company is involved in the whole issue.
And I guess in that context, you can then argue that I mean if you take the US, for example, or even Germany, is that a lot of the political decision makers on a national level are not from the regions where there's geothermal, so they don't know, they haven't seen it, and that translates then in the support that the industry gets on a national level, and that's been a big part. So, for example, in the US, you know, the political arena is in the east of the country, in Washington D.C., while most of the geothermal is in Nevada and in California, and that is far away. And given that most of the geothermal would also be developed there, doesn't make it attractive across the whole country. So it comes down more on that local and national level. And I think we've seen this in Germany with, I mean, the government of Bavaria has understood geothermal as an opportunity and has announced the support of the industry as much as they can as part of the government. Correct me when I'm wrong, but that was the impression. But this hasn't translated in the national support. And I think this is probably an interesting element, is that it's basically, you know, the decision makers, having them experience geothermal.
Yes, but perhaps it's also what you have to consider. Geothermal is not possible everywhere. And in contrast, wind and solar is possible everywhere. So you got regions which also belong to the country, which has no profit if you fund geothermal, but they can profit from having here solar or wind.
No, but I think this is, and I think this is where the political arena is mistaken, is that we see certain elements as the key solutions to something, while we need to understand that the renewable energy and the energy markets of the future will include various technologies, not only wind and solar.
That's true.
And is really understanding that we need this mix of technologies, and geothermal is part of that mix. It might not be all over the country, but it is an important part, for example, in Bavaria or in Baden-Württemberg in Germany, or in California and in Nevada. And I think this is to be understood, that regionally certain elements play a more important role, and that's why they're important there, but still need the support. And this is the part that is the regional role that geothermal can play, needs to be emphasized. And the notion is also the economic development opportunity connected to geothermal. I think there's several studies done, is that the economic impact of a geothermal plant on a municipality or a community is much more than a wind and solar plant. Reasons as simple as that is that you have a windmill, you have a solar installation, you have a cable that takes the electricity and it's gone. And you might get royalties based on where the country you are in, but otherwise that's gone. Geothermal, yes, you have a geothermal plant, you have a cable, you take the electricity out as well, but you need stuff on site. So jobs. Secondly, if you utilize the heat would be utilized locally, either in a district heating system, impacting directly the population, or by a business setting up, for example, greenhouses, creating jobs on site. So this is the economic element of what geothermal offers, is something that we need to emphasize more, and that also gives us a better political message.
Yes, you're right. You're right. Okay, there is another question, a last question here. Do you have any idea of percentage of costs relation between downhole and surface for a typical 25 megawatt geothermal plant?
A price estimate, is that the question?
2/3 downhole, 1/3 above.
Sorry, no, I would not know. Sorry.
Okay. Then here a few more comments. Comprehensive and most excellent answer. Thank you. Great presentation. Great presentation. Thank you. And one thing to mention, if you search at YouTube for EnerChange, you find our site where the videos can be seen from the past webinars. So we can proceed again to the Frankfurt event. Just say something more to the structure. We will have in the morning kind of risk issues from different perspectives, and in the afternoon we will look in certain countries with a country overview, and afterwards with a specific presentation to the country or to a project. And last but not least, let me mention our next webinar. Next week, again, there is a Blickpunkt Geothermie, a German webinar, and it's just about an issue we discussed. It will be by the KIT, by Sebastian Held, and it's about the thermal water preparation for the raw material extraction. So from my side, thanks a lot, Alex, for loads of questions, for a nice presentation. Thank you as people who followed the webinar for your nice questions, and looking forward to see you soon, either in the next week or at the other events. And have a nice weekend and stay healthy. Bye-bye.